We could not make camp in the damp forest glade, so I led my companions along an old path towards the base of the mountain. It was overgrown with all manner of foliage, and the footing was difficult. Armor and weapons littered the path, and stakes stood tall, covered with vines and moss. Glancing around, I spotted a magnificent blade. Light yet firm and unblemished by the elements, it shone in the rain and lightning, a lone light in the darkening trail. The hilt was fashioned from steel inlaid with silver and gold to form the figure of a defiant, wingless dragon. As we reached the summit, I could not believe my eyes. A ruined yet imposing castle loomed above us. Quietly rejoicing, my comrades moved towards their new camp. Then we heard the howls. Two massive wolves bounded out of the door of the castle towards my soldiers. Fearing for their lives, they drew weapons, only to hear a voice from the shadows address the wolves, or the men, in a thick Wallachian accent. "Stand down, fellows!" Throwing large slabs of meat to the ravenous wolves, he calmed them and satiated their hunger. Then he turned to us. "Welcome to Polyanari Castle, the ancient stronghold of the Draculesti." The mysterious man raised his hands in a gesture of welcome. "It is well that your path has led you here. Come inside, sit by the fire and feast, while I tell you the tale of Vlad Dracula. I stepped forth, holding out the mysterious sword and scabbard for our host to inspect. "The Order of the Dragon," he said at once. "What you have just brought me is the lost blade of Vlad Dracula himself." I was shocked and immediately demanded an explanation. Our host's eyes flashed, and there was a strained look on his face. Finally, the rush of memories seemed to slow and become more controlled. That is a long story. But then again, we have a long time until dawn. Dracula sought refuge at the Moldavian court. There, he learned that Vladislav II had begun to mediate peace talks between the Ottomans and Hungarians, securing his position as voivode of Wallachia. Furious, Dracula swore vengeance on Ottomans, Wallachian boyars, and Danish clansmen alike. Dracula knew that he needed to enlist the aid of the Hungarians against Vladislav II, whose policies favored the Ottomans. He also remembered his education under the Crusading Order of the Dragon, and wanted to honor his vows. The Order was a powerful ally, and their Crusader knights would serve Dracula well against his enemies. As he paced the streets of the Moldavian capital, Dracula mused over his plan to reclaim his kingdom. As the mysterious old man paused, I rose up to take another slab of venison. The old man stared into the fire, watching the flames dance as if they were soldiers involved in a raging battle. His eyes flashed again as a thought entered his mind, and he grasped the majestic old sword. Meanwhile, Sultan Mehmet II had ascended to the Ottoman throne. Dracula loathed Mehmet from their time in Edirne, and he knew that the Turks would be a thorn in his side for years to come. In 1453 they had conquered Constantinople, but they were presently occupied with campaigns in Greece and Serbia. Bogdan II, Dracula's cousin and the new voivode of Moldavia had heard of his kinsman's plight and offered his help. If Dracula could cross the Carpathian Mountains into Transylvania and ally with Hungary, then they could launch a three-pronged assault on Vladislav II and the Turks. The elderly man gave a thin smile. Tenacity of mind can compensate for other disadvantages. As Dracula slaughtered untold numbers of enemy troops, the large circle of impaled men outside Targovishta grew to awe and disgust travelers for weeks to come. Dracula owned Wallachia once more, but it was not the land his forebears ruled. Barren from endless wars, it was rife with corruption, crime, and poverty. Aghast, I asked my host how Dracula managed to reform a ruined shell of a country so quickly. Grinning, the light flashed across the old man's eye again. Dracula despised dishonesty and crime, and sought to eliminate it. He knew that Wallachia had to become strong enough to face its enemies, and soon. And so, his reforms began. The punishment for all offenses was death, for Dracula needed to make an example of criminals. Under his strong rule, trade was reopened and the economy blossomed. Proud of his achievement, Dracula placed a golden cup in the central square of Targovishta. The cup was never once touched throughout his reign. I was shocked. The share of the stake was surely enough to prevent crime, but to rule Wallachia while simultaneously evading the plots of the boyars was no small feat. Dracula invited all of the boyars to a feast and asked them how many rulers they had seen perish due to treachery. None had seen fewer than 7 reigns, while some had even seen 30. Furious, Dracula arrested them all and marched them here to the former ruin of Pulinari Castle. For months they labored to rebuild the castle, toiling even after their clothes fell off. Those who survived were slain. Finally, Dracula had eradicated the fickle, conniving boyars. He replaced them with loyal followers, be they knights or common peasants. Strong again, the dragon was ready to breathe a flame that would engulf his enemies, the Turks. This wise man, whomever he was certainly no commoner. I wondered aloud if perhaps he had fought in the wars of which he spoke. My question was answered with a grin and a nod. I was awed. To encounter a soldier who has survived those years of turmoil and bloody warfare was rare. We sacked Giorgio, Darstor, Novoselo, Dridopoirom, and many more towns, he muttered, revealing the scars on his arms. Our strikes were swifter than bolts of lightning. Yes, we have peace now. But I have never found it. Not a single day goes by when I do not think about it. Dracula never breathed a word of it, but many began to think that his time at the Ottoman court had stoked his hatred for his southern neighbor. For years, he had brooded over his brother, Radu, who had treacherously pledged himself to the Turks. Dracula also had his vows to the Order of the Dragon to consider. The Pope and the Hungarian regent both desired war with the Turks. In the year 1462, Sultan Mehmet II renewed his efforts and sent a force of 18,000 into Wallachia. Thinking that Dracula would be unable to mobilize his army quickly enough, the Sultan sought to take Wallachia by storm with this small force. He was, of course, sadly mistaken. I had heard whispers of the Danube butchering, but never a first-hand account. Dracula's enduring ability to overcome the most fearsome force of his time mesmerized me. Dracula had a thirst for blood unlike any other, but he was fair. His sense of justice wrought a change in all of us. Dracula taught us to use our strengths to our advantage. Terror, speed, and surprise became weapons more potent than our blades. Unfortunately, this was where my lord and I were separated. The Turks entered the castle courtyard of Poyanari with murder on their minds and ransacked the fortress that we had fought so hard to defend. Taking refuge in a secret tunnel, I watched Dracula's boat float downstream. The stone bastions of Poyanari never caught flame, so I was spared. As if God was with us, an avalanche struck the departing Turkish army and blocked the route to the castle. Although this evidence of divine retribution stirred our host, I figured it was caused by the enemy camp. I was not eased by the change in the mood of our host. The calls of wolves and the bats filled the air as we feasted. It seemed that the old man was lost in ruminations of times long gone by. Finally, the ancient warrior resumed his tale. It was a long 12 years. I was alone, waiting here for signs of Dracula's return. But all I ever saw were Turkish marauders ravaging the countryside of this once beautiful land and tormenting the people. One thing kept me from despair. The last words I had heard from my lord, that he would return in the end. I repeated these words to myself every day and promised myself that he would succeed. It was a fool's hope, but it was the best that I had. So I endured. Dracula had preserved enough food and water in the castle to last an entire army several years. I had begun to think that he would never return. But rumor among the locals told me differently. When I overheard the same as I spied on Turkish patrols, I became more confident. I shuddered at the sight of the land that he would return to. One day, I awoke to the thundering of hooves and the frenzied war cries of soldiers pouring down from the Carpathians. It was Dracula, at the head of a Hungarian army, come at last to liberate us from the yoke of the Turks and their Wallachian puppet, Basarab Leota. Dracula achieved victory at last, and the invaders fled before him. Rallying his men, he charged the enemy ranks with an unspeakable vengeance that emboldened his army. A decisive victory was near, but it was at that hour a volley of arrows whistled through the air and struck Dracula in the chest, knocking him from his horse. The Turks easily routed our leaderless forces. A chance to drive them out and vanish. The occupation resumed, and the survivors disappeared. despair. The memory of a great man endures forever. As a token of gratitude, I invited our host to join us in a pilgrimage to the monastery at Snagaf to pay our respects to Dracula's grave. Tears running down his face, the elderly man